Good afternoon and welcome to today's live stream here on DreamBank's Facebook page. My name is Andy Frisky and I'm a Dream Curator for DreamBank. Thank you for all who are tuning in today. For those of you who have been watching a lot of our videos and content we've been putting out since the pandemic, thank you much. For those of you that are just tuning in for the first time, just want to give you a little bit of context about who we are and why we're here today. So DreamBank is a free community resource located in the heart of Madison, Wisconsin, and we're put on by American Family Insurance. The whole reason why we exist is to help inspire people to pursue their dreams. In a large part, that's done through the programs that we offer. When we're not under a pandemic, we host right around 40 free events a month in our physical space. Anything ranging from small business and entrepreneurial workshops to inspiration, motivational wellness speaker series. We host fitness events in our space. We have career development events, family-related activities on the weekends. We have a crafting series. So those are just a few. In addition to that, we also have an interactive exhibit that's located on site, rotates about 3 times a year. And then we also have a drop-in co-working space that folks are able to utilize as well. Since the pandemic, we've pivoted to the virtual space as well too, as you can see here. But we have a ton of other great videos aside from the one that we're about to have today. Go ahead and head over to where you're viewing this video. I'm sure is DreamBank's Facebook page, which is facebook.com/DreamBankMSN. I just wanted to highlight briefly one activity that we have coming up, which is our Dream Summit. So this will be the 3rd year that we've had the Dream Summit. It'll be all virtual this year, but that's going to be on September 30th and October 1st. Without further ado, though, I would like to introduce our featured speaker. So Laura Gmeinder is a certified coach, strategic consultant, and in-demand national speaker. She's made it her life's mission to empower women and provide the support they need to be successful on their terms in business and in life. With over 20 years experience in women's leadership and business, her sweet spot is the intersection of mindset and strategy, the can-do and action plan we all need to doubt ourselves less and take more inspired action. Her story, she survived a quarter-life crisis, made friends with her fear, courageously left her corporate HR job after 14 years, and set out to make an impact in the world. Her entrepreneurial spirit has led her to start several award-winning businesses, including Laura Gmeinder Coaching and Consulting. She's been recognized in Business Magazine as a 40 under 40, honored for her business savvy and clinic contributions, and a Bravo Women to Watch. Laura's committed to building community and giving back. She supports business development for members of the Doyen Group and provides business coaching for the Coaching Fellowship, a nonprofit that empowers women leadership worldwide. She's a judge for the International Stevie Awards in Women in Business. Laura's a graduate of Leadership Greater Madison and a past president of the Junior League of Madison. Laura strives to live an interesting life. The above was accomplished in the spirit of do one thing every day that scares you. Without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Laura.
Thank you, Andy. I really appreciate it. And my do one thing that scares you today is this. This is the first time for me, so I really appreciate Andy's support and just the DreamBank's wonderful programming as we're all going through a pandemic and everything else that's going on in the world. And I guess my one disclaimer is I tried to keep things pretty light today. So I hope that you'll get a lot of tips and ideas for taking back your time and getting what you want and need at work. So first things first, we got this little clicker action, yay. I'm gonna take you back to good old 1999 when things looked a little bit different and a lot the same at the same time. One of the things that always has stood out to me about this movie is just it's always so tongue-in-cheek about how the workplace is. So think about those days of the cube. Think about those office days. Think about the work that never seems to end, a lot of sticky notes. And think about the one thing that your boss could say that would leave you shaking in your boots. I'm gonna need you to go ahead and come in tomorrow. Set on a Friday at 5 minutes to 5. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to need you to come in on Sunday too. Well, the main character in the movie Office Space doesn't really say much, goes home and ends up sleeping in, blowing his boss off. Talk about some boundaries we can set there, right? So today we're going to talk a little bit about taking back your time and what that really means. And the reason that it's so important is that as OC Tanner study shared, and probably we didn't need a study on this, right? 79% of employees experience burnout. I would say that's probably like 100%. Like everyone I know is in one way or the other struggling. We're in an uncertainty, we are in change, we are grieving our normal, trying to transition to a new normal, some of us, but it's kind of hard. And so that's why with this topic, I did try to keep it kind of light, to really be able to give you some tips and techniques, but also just to keep light of the sense of, we're all in this together and it is hard. And maybe these tips will be, today's conversation will really encourage you to have that hard conversation or to set different boundaries if you are someone who is feeling like they are burned out or getting there. And just to kind of dial it back a little bit, I love how being an adult is just saying, but after this week, things will slow down a bit again, to yourself until you die. But seriously, we kind of rationalize some of that when we know our workload is too much, when we're trying to work, we're trying to teach the kids at home, maybe we're trying to help our family, older parents remotely now. Like we just have a lot going on these days and it does get hard. And our coping mechanism sometimes is like, oh, next week will be better. And maybe that's true, but maybe that's just kind of something we're telling ourselves to get through the day when really we need to start prioritizing and being intentional. The idea of doing less is just not coded into high achieving people's sense of self. If you're watching this today, maybe you can relate to that quote. An associate professor in information and organization management at the University of California, Irvine, shared that in a recent article. But that is where we kind of sit, that so many of us are high achieving. So many of us want careers, families, kids, hobbies. We want it all and wish instead of 24 hours, we had 28 or 30 hours in a day. But even more now when we're being asked to do more and we're also, our coping is lower, our stress is higher, we're really just not able to do as much as we've done in the past. This is hard for so many of us. And thinking about it from, kicking it back to high school, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but so many of us aspire to be that level of self-actualization, but right now, like just even some of us to get our basic needs met, the, food, water and shelter. And what does that look like? Safety and security. Like our world is kind of unsettled some ways. And so really thinking about where we are and just kind of, maybe setting that bar a little lower from how we have aspired to be in the past to do what you need to do. Because right now we are in a marathon and we can't see the finish line. This is not a sprint. We need to pace ourselves. And I know that that's the reminder I give myself often to be more compassionate with myself. And when I try to do too much and I'm starting to feel burned out, to be able to pull back and use boundaries to say no, to really check in with myself and to see what is going to be the best for not where I am today, but really for, the long term. And so here we are today. What are boundaries? A couple years ago, I took a life certification class and my coach, Marian Franklin, asked us, what are boundaries? And without hesitating, I go, rules. And she was like, oh, we're going to have some work to do. But really, boundaries are your values in action. They're the behaviors. We are how our standards, how we want to interact with people, what feels good to us. And so for all of us, that's going to look a little bit different. And so really kind of what does that look like to what types of boundaries, right? You hear the word boundaries, not necessarily rules, but kind of standard, like that fence that keeps us a little bit of distance between us and our neighbors when we need it. But the types of boundaries are emotional, physical, intellectual, sexual, material, and energy, which this had said time, so that's why it's in red. Because to me, it's not just about taking back your time, it's really about guarding your energy. And so maybe some of these other types of boundaries would come up at work. But today we're really going to be focusing in on the time, the energy piece of it. And so some of it will even be things that you can apply to other types of boundaries in your life, like the formula and the tips that I'll share can be applied to some of these other types of boundaries as well. Okay. Why do we need boundaries, right? Ugh, I tell you. But if you've ever had a time at work where you've just been really frustrated with a coworker, maybe you do have that boss that wants you to come in and work weekends, or if you don't work weekends, you know, whatever is that shift you definitely don't want to do, that's not part of your normal, your work process, you know, thinking about that, like, where is that boundary and why do we need boundaries? Entrepreneur magazine question this month in their magazine, are we productive or are we just busy? And I think that that is the call towards being intentional with our time at work. And knowing that this right now really is a struggle for a lot of people, that we're on autopilot, that we're just trying to get through. I don't know about you, but it's like one Zoom meeting after another, and we're getting Zoom fatigue. And we're on these meetings, but you know, someone confessed to me the other day, they're like, I just turn the camera off and then I'll do, like, you know, fold laundry, or, you know, people are multitasking. But a lot of times, like, we're going to these meetings because we're invited, we think we need to, but really, are we being productive or are we just being busy? So why do we need boundaries other than to, you know, get on top of that busyness and really be focused on productivity? But signs that you need better boundaries: you hate letting people down. How many of these can you relate to? You hate letting people down. You feel guilty when putting yourself first. You're worried if you say no, people won't like you, which is a really big one that I hear a lot. You're feeling burned out, like we talked about earlier. Agree with others to keep the peace when it might keep the peace with others, but what does that feel like inside? Keeping the peace with others, we're creating a battle within then often. And, you know, struggling to make decision fatigue, what that piece of it looks like if you don't put yourself first. And then often then we feel taken advantage of or even resentful. And, you know, talking about resentful and other emotions, like, emotions are messengers for us. So when you're starting to not feel good about work, a coworker, a boss, a project, like, what is going on there and what are your emotions trying to tell you about that? So why do we hesitate to share our boundaries? The billion, jillion, trillion dollar question. But really, it kind of comes back down to that whole idea around being likable. And often people ask me what books I'm reading, and this one is too good not to mention right now. Break the Good Girl Myth. And why we don't tell people and share our boundaries is because we've bought into these myths. And really, so it's about unlearning how many of us, especially women, as girls, were raised. You know, if you follow the rules, you'll get ahead. If you're perfect, what does that look like? If you perform to a really high level, but perfect doesn't exist. And, you know, if we're holding ourselves and our team to perfect, like, you might be the one that is really, you know, pushing people over to the edge to burnout. Like, perfect doesn't exist, but we really strive for that, especially when we're stressed, especially when we're overloaded. That's like a coping mechanism for some of us. Also, the myth of harmony, kind of talking about what I mentioned earlier around, you know, the idea around keeping the peace. You know, if I avoid being difficult, there won't be any problems and everyone will just get along. And I think part of that too is the idea around being likable in the workplace. And studies have shown that that is one of the things that does help women advance their careers. So you have to kind of deal with where your boundaries are, what your energy and time limits are, but then also too, to be likable. You know, and so there's that conflict. And then also sacrifice, which of course, you know, women always put others first. We're taught to be the helper. We're taught to take care of the caretakers. And so often putting other people's needs first as well, which then, you know, may look like doing more than your share of work. The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. A quote by Alice Walker, feminist and author of The Color Purple. But I think that that really is true. It's so often that people say they're hesitant to share their boundaries, especially at work, because what if there's consequences, and those are negative consequences? What if I will get, not get a promotion because I spoke out and said that it was too much work for me right now? What if I would get fired? But instead of focusing on the what ifs, I encourage people, like, what so? What is so? What are the facts of the situation versus, what's kind of fiction? What is that story we're telling ourselves to keep ourselves safe? Like, I can't talk about my workload. I can't talk about my workload with my boss because, there's going to be those negative repercussions. But how do you know if you never talk to your boss? And then on occasion, I'll have clients that are just fed up. They're like, I don't care. I don't even have another job. I'm done. I'm just going to be done. But if you don't talk to your boss, if you don't talk to HR, if you aren't talking to people about what your needs are at work, how can they even accommodate those? So you're already by not having that conversation, you're already putting them in the position of saying no. So you're saying no to yourself because you're not willing to have that conversation. So how do you set boundaries? How do you set boundaries? What we're going to focus on today is a framework for setting boundaries, because we already talked about people really hesitate to have those conversations, but it'll linger. It's not going anywhere. So it's just putting off the inevitable. So what does it look like to have those kinds of conversations with a coworker, or even scarier, a boss for some people, right? When trying to teach someone a boundary, they learn less from the enforcement of the boundary and more from the way the boundary was established. So taking a step back, it's really like, how are you focusing on the relationship? And really, we get meaning from work. And one of the needs we get met for work as in our society is really that sense of belonging. And what does that look like to have a high level of trust? So the focus is on, how do I have this conversation about what my needs are, and do it in a way that doesn't have a negative impact on the relationship? And often these conversations build trust. They often will grow the relationship when you show up very authentic and transparent in the workplace. So what is step one? If you have a situation where, maybe you have that coworker that is always giving you a project, Friday afternoon and wanting it first thing Monday. It's like, well, if you're like me, I ain't gonna work over the weekend necessarily. That doesn't feel good to me. That's not aligned with my values. So thinking about, if you have situations that come up that are not feeling good, that don't make you feel appreciated, that list of, resentful, that list that we talked about of maybe reasons of why you would need boundaries, recognize what is the situation, just really being focused on the facts, but then also too thinking about it from, has this shown up in other places of your life? Maybe it's something you struggle with, so you're more sensitive. It maybe is even a trigger for you, but really, what is kind of the context of the situation, and looking at it from all angles. And I think too, these two questions to be really focused on, what will be different once I've established better boundaries, and how do I want to feel when my boundary is in place? Like, reflecting on these two questions, and then I have a little, it's supposed to be a little GIF here. So imagine a fire on a cold, gloomy Tuesday. But really, like, thinking about it as, these can be your motivation. This can be what fuels your fire, to really be thinking about what's going to be different, what's going to change. Like, and by not changing or not having the conversation, what is that costing me? It might be sleepless nights. It might be arguing with your spouse. It might be, short and snapping with your kids. Because you're overworked and you're not being appreciated. Like, what does that look like to want something different? And then how will you feel when your boundary is in place? Like, you're asking people to treat you in a way that's aligned with your values. Like, that feels good. That builds your confidence. And so thinking about these two questions and reflecting on them, with your, scenario in mind of how you want things differently, that when you do kind of worry about, but what if I have that conversation, and there's consequences, it's like, but at the same time, like, what if you don't have that conversation, and what could change, like thinking about, instead of like what if, and like worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario? Like, it could be a new project, it could be better work hours, it could just be more, compassionate empathy from your boss. But what does that really look like to you? What do you want to change? So, step 2 is reflect. And those questions are great, but really just like reflecting too on, how do you want that conversation to go? What are the pieces that need to be included to really state a boundary and to ask for something different? So here are a few tips that I share just to really help with that conversation. And we have, at the end of this, there's a website address, and I have a Building Better Boundaries worksheet that will also walk you through the steps. And these are just a few tips I share, just because I do know that people are hesitant to have these conversations. So the more you prepare, the more that you are able to really show up in the conversation, knowing what you want and asking for it. And so, to be clear and concise, to have that, whether you're, taking notes like on your worksheet, or maybe you're talking to a coworker, maybe you work with a coach, maybe you're doing some role play, that worst case, best case scenario, so you feel comfortable handling the situation no matter what happens. Using I feel statements or how can we statements, but really taking the onus of like, this is what I'm asking for, this is what we need. And the we piece of it, the team, the company, like how is what you're asking for aligned with what the company and the team need as well. And then calm your nerves. I actually had a typo and it said claim your nerves, but really I think we can relate to the thinking about this. Having this type of conversation is nerve-wracking for a lot of people. And so I think, like, what can you do to calm your nerves? Like, maybe you're taking a walk. I always do EFT tapping, which is a process to kind of help process through some of that extra energy in your body. But what can you do to calm your nerves, so again, that you're at your best when you're having a conversation like this? And then I also recommend having a boundary buddy. That's the person that you can go to say, oh my gosh, I have to tell my boss that I have to, be done working at 4 when typically we've been working to 6. I'm really worried about having that conversation. And that's the person that you can go to after and kind of debrief. That's the person that's going to be your cheerleader. That's the person that's going to be supporting you. But just knowing you have that, like, no matter how the conversation goes, you have that person that's going to really, build you up after that conversation and direct you back to yourself. Like, you had to have that conversation that was important to you. And I'm proud of you for doing that. So step 3, request. But really that's asking, that's telling, that's like, what do you want? How do you want things to be different? And then also too, you might not necessarily have a conversation where you're talking to your boss about consequences. However, if you're overwhelmed and feeling like you're burning out and nothing is going to be changing with your workload, maybe the consequences, like, I'm going to have to leave and look for something different. So that's kind of why it's in parentheses, because every conversation won't necessarily have a consequence with it, but many will. And so how do you make that request? And sometimes I start small too, thinking about both personal and professional, but sometimes just even calling out how you're feeling, what that looks like, and then what's something different you want to see together, but kind of focusing in on a request. And then if necessary, if that's appropriate, then consequences too, if your boundaries get broken, if what you're asking for, your needs aren't being met, what does that look like? And so I just had one screen here for those. I'll also have the PowerPoint, the PDF that you can access. And so just did a screen if you're just wanting to kind of print that out, or just having a quick little cheat sheet to recognize, reflect, and request. So thinking about taking back your time, we're going to talk through a few examples. What if your workload isn't sustainable, right? You know, you are about to feel like you're at that brink of burnout, and you're not enjoying what you're doing, and you're just feeling tired and crabby, and you're maybe not sleeping. And how do you change that? Do you A, avoid your boss? You're so mad at them. B, complain to all of your coworkers. C, start looking for a new job. Or D, ask your boss to help you prioritize and delegate to create a more sustainable workload. The answer is D, ask your boss to help you prioritize and delegate to create a more sustainable workload. And for some people, depending on what your scenario is, you know, C might be an answer too to what is out there. Sometimes people think the grass is greener. Sometimes, you know, if your boundary is not met, if you're not being valued for what you're bringing to the team and the company, some companies that busy, that drive for perfection, that inevitable burnout, like sometimes that's part of company culture. So maybe you're just not in a company that's a right fit. But thinking about options, what does that look like for you? Instead of saying, I'm super overwhelmed and can't handle one more thing, take a growth approach. Consider, thank you for thinking of me. I am feeling spread thin, but I'd enjoy working on that. Could we review priorities and delegate to other team members to make room for this new project? That's a big ask, right? Because you're not only saying like, this is what I need and want, but then you're also, you know, potentially giving some of your coworkers more work. But really thinking about what is best for the team, and you're asking your boss as a leader to help you, to give you more exciting work, to give you more challenging projects. And that's what leaders are paid for. That's what our bosses are paid for, is to grow new leaders, to create new leaders, and to really meet you where you're at professionally and personally. Those are the best leaders that we can ask for. So thinking about guard your energy. For example, one of the CEOs I worked with, he was not sure what to do. He had a new employee, and the employee was, you know, they gave someone a chance. They saw all this potential, and they were so glad that they did, because this person like hit the ground running. They were super excited. They were bringing like so much energy, so many great new ideas. The one downside of this was that the CEO was all of a sudden of the startup was getting texts on the weekend. And not only were these texts about the projects that they were working on, they were also things that needed attention, they needed approval, they needed feedback. And so the CEO was getting these texts on the weekend when the workload for everyone has been really, you know, crazy. And so it was like, how do you handle that? Because you don't want to squash someone's enthusiasm. However, you need to set good boundaries. And then two, as a leader, you're modeling the way. You are showing people what is acceptable, especially for a new employee. And so to not say anything, you don't want to do that, right? You want to do it in a way that is kind, that builds a relationship, and that keeps that enthusiasm for both the project and the company. So do you, A, ignore the text, B, send them a dancing dog GIF, which right now you would be seeing this poodle like, you're welcome. Thank them and share that you are recharging your batteries, and we'll follow up on Monday. Or D, go to HR and report them. Right? The answer is C. Honestly, like as a former HR lady, the only time I ever mention getting HR involved would be potentially if you're not sure, like if you're a new employee and you have to have a boundaries conversation and you're just not sure what the expectation is, what the company culture is, you might just, be able to have a friendly conversation with HR if you don't feel comfortable talking to your boss. And then two, if it would be extreme where you're having like a ton of text and maybe there's some inappropriateness and like kind of taking that situation to a very, very extreme, those would be kind of the situations where it would warrant HR getting involved. Otherwise, doing that is just, passive aggressive, and it's just not really handling it in a good way. If someone's texting you, a new employee is texting you, it's probably because you haven't put that boundary when they, started to say, oh, this is, when I'm available to you. I'm available to you Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or something like that. So, because that's really the easiest time to set boundaries is when we're starting a new job at a new company, working with a new coworker, but having like that clean slate of the relationship. Instead of saying, please stop texting me, I'm busy with my family, take a relationship building approach. Consider, I know you're excited about your project and I'm here to support you. I need my weekends to recharge, so let's discuss Monday at 3:30. Thanks for your hard work on this. Occasionally people say like, well, should I just like ignore it? And then they'll like figure it out when I never respond. Except again, like that's kind of passive aggressive. And we've all been on the other end of an unreturned text or an unreturned email. Like the way that technology is these days, it's like, did they get it? Do they care? Is that approval? Is that, they're just not buying into this project? Like it leaves your mind wondering with all those what ifs, and then it's like that missing puzzle piece of like trying to figure out what your boss is thinking or the person on the other end of the communication. So thinking about building boundaries, but then also having that open communication, the more that you can be communicative, especially right now with everything going on and with people under so much stress, the more you can communicate, the better it's going to be for the relationship. So what if? We talked about those what if questions, right? What if I get pushback? I set a boundary. It was really hard to have that conversation, and now I'm done. Can you relate to that? That's kind of how I get. Like, I'm like, it was just so much effort and courage to have that initial conversation. I no longer want to talk about that. You just need to do that. But, what if you get pushback? And the reality is, sometimes it's just reiterating that boundary, when you're asking for someone, I'm not working Friday after 5. I'm not working the weekend. I can't help you with that project. But just kind of repeating that if you are getting the pushback, to be like, oh, but everybody's busy. I'm sorry, I can't help you with that project. But to really kind of stand your ground on that, because sometimes that's how people respond, to almost like bully you, to challenge that boundary, to see how tight you're going to hold it. And then another thing to keep in mind is, the 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. But thinking about it, if you are asserting a boundary, that's something that may or may not have occurred in the relationship before. And so you're asking someone to do a new habit. And the thing is that like you can't control people's behavior. And even if you are asking them to do something different and they are committing to you that they can do that, habits take time. Like, just even to, if you're going to add, for example, say that instead of drinking 2 glasses of water a day, you're going to drink 3 glasses of water a day. Scientific studies have proven that even to introduce a simple additional habit like that, you're already drinking the water, so you're just drinking an extra glass of water, but it takes 21 to 90 days for that to become a routine. So thinking about your boundaries, if you do get pushback, thinking about the 3 strikes rule, but just thinking about it, and that, being patient with someone, you're asking them to do something different, and that just because they break your boundary after you've talked about it doesn't mean they're disrespecting you, doesn't mean they're disrespecting your boundary. It might mean they forgot. It might mean that they're their habit that's ingrained in them, like they're having a hard time overriding that. And again, it depends what the boundary in and of itself. Maybe there are some boundaries that once you set that, you draw that line in the sand, maybe there is no crossing it. But for most things, to give people the benefit of the doubt that maybe they, just forgot or they need that gentle reminder. So how do you deal with other people's boundaries? Maybe someone's having the courage to talk to you about something they need different in their relationship. Thinking about a few tips, thank them. I mean, that shows a lot of courage. They care about you enough to have that conversation, especially where we are in our culture. We're like, ghosting is a thing. Like, instead of having an adult conversation with you, I'm just going to disappear or stop talking to you. So, thanking people, recognizing that it took courage and that they, care enough about you to want something different in their relationship. And then responding with curiosity and compassion. If people are sharing a boundary, what are the questions that are coming up for you? And maybe the more context that you have around the situation really will help you to honor that boundary, that need, that non-negotiable they have. Maybe, even incorporate it within the team, or what does that look like on a project? And then also having compassion. Like, we are all going through a lot right now. And, how can you show up with compassion to really build trust, build the relationship, and to understand maybe, that piece of that empathy of like, I don't necessarily know what you're going through, but I can, be here to support you and do what I can. And then in that turn too, trying to offer a win-win if possible. Maybe someone's boundaries are what they're asking, maybe someone's saying, the kids are back in school and it's just so hard. And it seems like Mondays in particularly are really frantic in our household. Is it possible that I take Monday mornings off and only work Monday afternoon? That may or may not be possible, and kind of talking that through to see, what does work and what feels good for everybody. And then no is a complete sentence. But like, my caveat is, but context builds trust. So while you can say no, sometimes having that context of no, and then here's what's, taking into consideration that's influencing that no, if appropriate, and that's something you feel comfortable in, it would help the conversation. This is my favorite sentence. I don't really utter it that much, but just the idea of the sentence, like, if going back, dealing with other people's boundaries, permission to say that might work for you, but that doesn't work for me. That sentence was taught to me by my mentor coach, Marian Franklin, the mother of the life coaching as we know it. But that might work for you, but that doesn't work for me. So you're acknowledging that someone has a need, but that doesn't work for you. And so to be able to say that sometimes, to be able to have a conversation, it's not always going to work for you when someone asks for something different. So an example of that, one of my clients was talking to me the other day. She's been tasked with starting to delegate and have all these projects and to do mentoring. And she's really excited about that. However, she was talking through a frustration because she was having a challenge with the project because someone that she had pulled in had told her that they were only available by instant messaging between 10 and 6. And unfortunately, with meetings and other things, that just didn't work for her. So how do you handle that? Do you tell them you understand and drop them from the project? B, tell them that they are being ridiculous and they need to pull their weight on the project? C, say okay and pick up their slack. Next time you will ask someone else. D, explain to them your situation, why it doesn't work, and try to find a win-win. So the answer is D. Even though you might have one of those moments of stressfulness, want to tell them B, like suck it up and make it happen, which you would never say because you're a good leader and you care about your team and people. But the client that I was working with, like, they recognize that as a boundary and they're like, oh yeah, okay, you're only available through this time. Thanks for sharing that. I can totally like respect that. And there's that respecting it, but then like if it doesn't work for the project, if it doesn't work for your time, that's a problem. And so, you know, for example, like dropping them from the projects or asking, like not asking them next time without telling them to say, your availability does not accommodate our needs. And so, do you have any flexibility? Otherwise, you know, with this other project that was coming up, I thought you'd be a great fit. You love the work, you're really good at it. However, within the scope of it, your availability and what needs to be done, you know, that's just not going to be a good fit. So that they're understanding, like, because of that boundary, there are consequences versus just, you know, taking them at that boundary and not having any additional conversations around it. It's empowering them, and then it is challenging them, like, can we find a win-win on this? Otherwise, they're making that decision to say, nope, the most important thing is that boundary of 10 to 6. And I completely understand you need to find people that are more available, you know, at later times with, you know, many of us working with colleagues that aren't in our same time zone with the working from home or living at our office, as you can look at it too. So a person's success in life can usually be measured by the number of uncomfortable conversations he or she is willing to have. And if the one takeaway today, I would really, really love it if you kind of stuck this one up here, because I've seen it in so many different situations, but really, however courageous you are to have uncomfortable conversations, like that's going to be the quality of your life. Like that's going to be what helps you to be true to yourself and helps you to get your needs met, and just really that happiness and joy. You know, what that piece looks like to live really aligned with who you are, and really, really intentional as well. So I double dog dare you. Yep, I went there. I'm still back in 1999, I guess. But thinking about a conversation that you really need to have, whether it's with your boss, whether it's with someone you're on a project with, maybe it's a client, maybe it's your significant other. But what is that conversation that you really need to have about a boundary that you have been putting? So I would really double dog dare you to have that conversation. I created a workbook which aligns with what we talked about around creating those boundaries, and really to be able to have a process and have some time and space to think about how you want that conversation to go. And so I dare you to have that conversation, because if it's top of mind, then it's taking up your mental energy, and it's something one way or the other that'll need to be addressed. So maybe you're here now to have a little reminder, permission, or kind of that little like kick in the pants to have that conversation. So, and here, as I mentioned, the bonus, the Building Better Boundaries worksheet, and there's some tips for if you have to talk to your boss, if you have to talk to a coworker, if you own your own business and you have to talk to a client, perhaps. So that is on my website, lauragmeinder.com, and then it's in the resource portal. So you do need to have that link, and Andy said he would share that out as well. And so don't hesitate if there's anything I can do to support you with building better boundaries. And now we have time for answers and questions and answers. So Andy, if there were any that came through or any that are coming up for you, I'm happy to take those now.
Thank you so much for that, Laura. Yes, I go ahead and prefaced with some folks to go ahead and pass along your questions right now. I have one for you right off the bat. Fortunately, I'm not in a place to where this is the case anymore. But what would you say is, I guess, the first step that you would take in communicating with a manager for someone for where the boundaries weren't set early on, right? And you're trying to, you use the example of someone texting you on the weekend, and you used a very eloquent wording with that. But maybe for someone who's in a position that they haven't set those boundaries for the timeliness of when work is done, and it's to someone that may not necessarily accept that nice eloquent text that you have. What are maybe some precursor steps that you could take to ultimately get to that point to where you can establish that good, healthy boundary of the work-life balance? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think, like, to your point, sometimes even just acknowledging that there hasn't been a discussion around that, and to really be focused on like what your values are, like what's driving the conversation, and then being as specific as you can be on examples, and then to be able to have that open conversation. If they're not willing to have the conversation, well, that's your answer. If they're not willing to accommodate that boundary, well, what's up with that? Like, to be able to kind of talk it through and to see if there can be a win-win. But I think the more that you can have that open conversation around, what is truly sustainable, because that's the thing too, is that, and I know the world we live in, the economy we live in right now, like it's very skewed in that some industries are booming, some industries can't find enough workers, and other industries, are struggling. There's very few jobs. Like, so, when I mentioned earlier, kind of like, what's that context? Like, what's your company culture? But like, what are the options that are available to you as well? Kind of having that in mind. Like, if you aren't getting the support you need, if you're not getting your boundaries honored, is that where you can maybe, switch to a different department? Or is that looking for another job? Or is that, because of, the industry or the job you're in, that, that maybe for the short term, it might be something where you're like, well, I just might have to work within this, but at least I had that conversation, and then I can give myself some time to, to save money, to start talking to friends to see if there's, opportunities at their company, like to kind of build that strategy to say, for the short term, I can make this work, but for the long term, this isn't going to be a good fit for me.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. We've got a question from Lisa stating she loves the dare and asking if there's any advice on setting boundaries on yourself, self all capitalized.
Oh, like that. Thank you, Lisa. That is such a great question, because to me, sometimes that's the hardest, but at the same time, like, that's the easiest to get started with stuff. And I think for me, like, knowing my values, but then also knowing, like, my personality. For example, I said more than one time this weekend to my husband, I will have time for that at 1 p.m. on Tuesday. Because I really was trying to protect my space and energy, and knew that, this was something, for me that I really wanted to be my best for. And so there were things that can wait. And so you cannot see it. But all around me, there are piles of clothes, because I was not thinking for the long term, and set up a little construction project thinking, oh, I'll let the guys in and do their thing. So I did not win on that boundary for sure. But I think that, starting with yourself to set those boundaries, to being intentional, and like, what do you need to be able to give yourself the most time and energy? And for me, sometimes it's just not even thinking it through, like the example around having contractors come in to fix the closet. Like, I literally was like, oh, first of all, I didn't think they were going to come Friday when I asked. And then was like, okay, I'll just open the door and, show them what needs to be done. Half hour, they'll do their thing. Well, I forgot they're fixing all the closets. I had to literally move everything out of the closets, which took way too long. But then to kind of like cut that off and be like, okay, this was way more involved than I thought. And now the putting stuff back in can wait until I have more time or energy. but you know, kind of what are some of those personal boundaries that you need, and why do you need those to be really focused on that piece of it?
Thank you for that. That looks like all the questions that we've had coming in. I just want to go ahead and thank you all for tuning in today to this wonderful event. If you were curious about some of the other programming that we've done, or you like what you saw today, we have an amalgam of various past events that are still available for people to go ahead and view. If you head over to our website, our Facebook page, excuse me, which is facebook.com/DreamBank MSN. I'll go ahead and pop up Laura's slide here to go ahead and get a hold of her, which is Gmeinder.com/resource portal. Some really good stuff on there, and you can see some of the other services that that Laura offers as well. I also wanted to go ahead and mention one more time the Dream Summit that is coming up at the end of this month and the beginning of next month, September 30th and October 1st. It's a great mashup of a lot of the other programming that you might see standalone, but in a 2-day summit format. With that, I will go ahead and wrap it up there. Thanks again, Laura, for putting together this wonderful presentation. We will see you folks next time.
Bye.